Thank you all very much. Some of you I know, some of you I haven't met before, so it's a great pleasure. Well, we're going to start with storage because that's where we're starting with the collection. And really, if you haven't got adequate storage, that's going to be your first problem, isn't it? Doesn't matter whether it's a fancy purpose-built facility or whether you've got a couple of rooms in a historic house, a local house. Now, one of the books that I'll be talking about and referring to throughout, and I make no apology for promoting this publication, it's called Keeping Archives. It's published by the Australian Society of Archivists, and although it says Keeping Archives, the advice that's in there pertains to collections. Collections of private papers, documents, to a range of formats of material, because that's the great challenge for us working in the profession. It's managing the different formats. So I'll be talking about that along the way. Okay, storage basics. We've got to think about the building. If the structure of the building isn't sound, we're in trouble right from the start. We've got to talk about environmental conditions. Now, this can be a challenge. You may have had a lovely old building made available to your historical society, family history group. But of course it might have rising damp, it might have falling damp, it might have absence of any temperature controls. All those things have to be considered. Lighting, very basic, very simple things, but lighting. We all know the damage that lighting does, excessive lighting, does to fragile documents. If anyone went to see the Book of Kells some years ago down in Canberra, what was the way they stored it and had it on display? Semi-darkness. You went into the space and you could kind of walk around. It wasn't quite that bad, but it was darkened, and every day they turned the page over because even with that tiny bit of light, there was a potential for damage. So really, when we're talking about documents, archives, we're talking about potential for damage. Fire protection, very, very obvious. Of course, often too late, but we do need to think about fire protection. We need to think about having fire extinguishers, and if you can afford it, having proper and adequate fire protection. Security. For security often leads to fire, doesn't it? We know that people can break in to a facility and do all manner of damage, but sometimes they also like to light fires. Record storage, how you actually store your records. Staffing in public areas, there I know most of groups are run by volunteers. I belong to my own local historical society. We're all volunteers. But nevertheless, even there you have to have protocols. Maintenance, because even though you set it up and it's all perfect one day, it's like housework. The next day the dust is there again and you've got to keep up that maintenance. Pest management, we've got to have that. Doesn't matter where it is, there's always the risk of different types of pests, from the ones with 4 legs to the crawling sort, issues of mould. All of those sorts of things come back to whether we've got a good building, good environmental conditions, and we've got good security. And of course, disaster preparedness. That's what we've got to think about, because sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes they are major and catastrophic. Other times they are things where a window breaks, glass breaks, a bad storm. We've had very bad storms in Sydney, and of course in Western Australia they've had terrible storms. Windows can get broken with the best will in the world, and that can cause problems. Okay, the building. A few simple things. I'm not going to read out all these slides because you've got them in your handouts. But a few of the things I want to particularly mention are that brick and concrete walls and floors are a real problem in terms of damp. Anyone who's lived in a terrace house in Sydney around the inner city will know that there is a potentiality there for damp to come through. Simple things like making sure there are no gaps around windows and window frames. Making sure that if you do have windows and skylights, they're lovely of course, they let lots of nice natural light in, and in fact in some places they actually use them as a green method of lighting. But think about in a storage area, that's not such a great idea. So think about using window coverings to block heat, because that will reduce the cost of cooling, and also to block light. A good drainage system. I guess one of the rules of storage buildings, of buildings generally, and of housing construction, I've done a bit of home renovation, is avoid a flat roof, because what happens to any flat roof, no matter how wonderful? Eventually the membrane will deteriorate and eventually the water will come through, no matter what you do. And also think about environmental hazards, asbestos, polychlorinated biophenols. Now, we've got some guidelines on temperature range. They're guidelines and they derive from the storage standard which State Records has published on its website, which is a standard for government storage. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to follow this in your local society, but it's a good guide, isn't it? And of course, the other thing to remember with all of these sorts of things is if you've got documents like a storage standard and you're seeking some funding from perhaps a local council, because in many places local councils support historical societies, family history groups, if you've got a dire situation with heating, temperature control, etc., to be able to say there's a storage standard which says we've got unique documents, they need to be properly stored, properly housed. Constancy of temperature is the important thing. Massive changes are as dangerous as having too hot, too cold. Ceiling fans, simple thing, can keep things nicely moving along, and there's all kinds of dehumidifiers that you can buy that will keep your area nicely contained. With lighting, now there is a definition of lux which I got off the Wikipedia, so I won't go through it, but basically what we're talking about is having it as bright as it needs to be where you're working, where you're writing and listing and describing and providing services, but where you're storing, have low lighting or preferably no lighting, lighting that you turn off and on when you're not in the storage area. Some places have the luxury of having switches on a timer, so you switch it on, it's like in stairwells in units and in the common area, that you put the thing on, turns the light on so that you go up the stairs and then it pops off. So that's our definition of lux. Just go to the Wikipedia and there are devices for measuring the intensity of light. Okay, fire protection. Whatever system you have, it is absolutely essential that everyone knows how to exit the building. First and foremost, ultimately, disaster to lose a collection, but how much worse to have someone injured or hurt seriously with a fire. So you have to have your fire exits worked out, and everyone knows with lots of notices everywhere about that. So you always mark your exits. In fact, over there you'll see behind you is how you get out of this space. You go straight out onto Macquarie Street, onto the footpath of Macquarie Street, perhaps not right onto the street. Now, ideally, you should have smoke detectors. Very, very important. And such a great thing in houses. We know how the difference it makes having a smoke detector. Because, of course, one thing you should never allow in any of your storage areas or in any of the spaces where you have your records are cigarettes. Apart from the health hazard, they are a fire hazard. And they are a fire hazard when we say no smoking, because sometimes there is a tendency for people sometimes to be sneaky, but I'm sure no one here would ever do that. And of course, if you've got people, workmen there, sometimes they might forget and have a cigarette, so you need to be aware of that. You should have a supply of handheld extinguishers around, and they should be checked regularly to make sure that they will operate, and you need to know how to operate them. Security. Now, ideally an alarm system. Now, of course, that's going to cost you a lot of money, so probably not everyone can afford that. But make sure everything is locked up. Have a process for locking up when the last person goes. Have a process for saying who does have keys, and make sure you have a register of who has the keys. Oftentimes in societies, and when you have an election, a new executive or management team comes in, have a process for handing the keys over. If you're occupying council premises, sometimes a master key will be held by the council. You need to be aware of that, because you need to be aware of who might be coming into the building and into your space. Not to say that they're going to do anything that they shouldn't do, but for lots of groups you will have a computer, you'll have computer files, you'll have lots of other books and items, all of which have a value. and you don't want people just coming in. So make sure that you have those processes in place. But of course, one of the simplest things is to have good neighbours and make friends with your neighbours. So if there's someone occupying the building next door, let them know the hours that your rooms or your space are likely to be occupied, so that if they see someone there at 9 o'clock on a Sunday, they might get suspicious and they might ring a designated person. Those sort of things are very basic. Most people, in fact, like having someone ask them to do that kind of favour. It's part of, I guess, a community and a community spirit. Mostly it works very well. And of course, make sure that you have all of that documented. Make sure that you've got, right at the very beginning, and I don't think we have a slide about this, but a procedure manual. Now, those of us who work within an office area, and for me, working in government, we have procedure manuals for all manner of things. But sometimes having a working procedure manual for your local group is fantastic, where you can have contact details of the emergency numbers, contact details of places that provide particular services, contact details of your volunteers, and maybe some lists of processes and what happens on a Saturday and all those sorts of things. Now, record storage. Records need to be stored. They preferably in archival quality containers. Doesn't always cost a fortune, and sometimes you might be able to negotiate that you can get second-hand containers. Should never store records directly on the floor for the reasons that I've said in terms of moisture rising up. But the other one, something on the floor, a zealous housekeeping type person comes along, that must be rubbish. So really think about archival storage. Think about the way that you store your records. A lot of historical societies love storing things in 3-drawer filing cabinets. Who's got those? Yep. They're fine, they keep things nice and neat. But do think, if you're taking in collections of documents, as distinct from little things that you've collected about a particular building, because I always think of those sorts of folders as being information folders. But you might get someone in your local area, say a local dignitary who happens to have lots of interesting private papers. They might give you a box with their papers in them. What do you do with those? Do you break them up and put them into folders, or do you keep them together? Betty, I know Betty knows the answer. Yeah, so that's what we're talking about, those sorts of collections. And there's a lot of material around that you can get that is of archival quality. There are a lot of suppliers. Now, they do cost money, I know that. And most historical societies and family history groups operate on a shoestring. I know that as well. So we'll talk later about grants, but that's another way of sometimes, if you've got things well organised, you can try and get a grant, and that might buy some equipment. So boxing your records, it's a question of boxing them carefully, not overloading, because what we don't want is to have a box that's too heavy to lift. How many people have done that? Too heavy to lift. You can't, then you end up damaging. So economies, sometimes you think, oh well, we can squeeze it all into one box. No. Try and spread the items and make sure that they are supported. Store them on shelving, racking, cabinets, whatever, but that's just an example from some of state record storage. But sometimes storing on shelving in boxes. Now, the great thing about storing in boxes is that if you do have a sprinkler going off or you have water coming in, it's amazing how much protection the box gives. Likewise, even a bit dreadful, but if you had a small fire, amazing the amount of protection that those cardboard boxes provide. Make sure too that if you've got any sensitive records, now I know this for a fact, and even though I work at State Records, I still know it for a fact that many of you in local groups have some amazing records that have come from local councils. Registers of infectious diseases. I know that sometimes I'm not looking at anyone, I know that sometimes they have made their way from the council because councils were required to maintain those, and most of them did because that was a requirement. And sometimes when it's no longer needed for official purposes, it was given to a local historical society. Sometimes it was left somewhere and a very kind person from a historical society rescued it. But sometimes you might have material that is sensitive, that might have been donated to you from a local orphanage or not a government-run institution, but from somewhere else where the donor might say to you, look, these records are sensitive and they need to be closed so that people can't view them until 2020. Now, we'll be talking about accepting donations, and sometimes you might say, okay, for me and for this society, that's a reasonable request. But what you have to make sure is that you don't let people see them, that they are locked up. So you have to make sure all those things. And of course, the other thing about locking is you've also got to make sure you've got good ventilation. Now, there's some advice there on plastic packaging. I'm not going to go through that. That's in your handout. Now, caring for photos. Now, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes to do this one. Photographs are probably going to be one of your major collection items, apart from documents, yes? Yeah. Now, photos are a fantastic resource. The kind of photos that I hate are the photos that come to you with no identification. From someone's private page, they say, this came from Grandma, I couldn't bear to throw it out. And you look at it and you think, ah. Now, they're very frustrating. What State Records does, for some of these, is to put something on our website and say, can you help us identify this photo? Now that's easy for State Records, and we get lots of useful and very helpful advice. But you might find in your local group that if you've got a collection of photos that really are nice, perhaps you could make a copy of one of them and put some, or have a copy done and put an ad in the newspaper. You might get people, because you get a bit of publicity for your society. The local newspapers love stories like that, and you might get someone who'll come in and actually help you doing some identifications. But that is one of the worst things, and that's not caring for photos, it's just one of those things about photos. You must keep the area cool, dry and stable. We say don't store in attics, too hot, basements too damp, cupboards next to kitchens too likely to be damp, and cupboards next to an external wall, no matter how good, damp. Amazing. You go even to your own home after all this rain and just feel the wall. Yes. You can feel the damp. Okay, so there's some guidance there about shelving. Always store the materials separately from the collection. Now, with slide-on boxes, you can get purpose-built boxes. Allbox is just one of those companies that provides special storage for photos in sleeves, plastic sleeves. You think about that. And later on, we'll be talking about digitisation and how you can describe them. Okay, so these are all just some advice. Those albums that were popular about 20, 30 years ago with adhesives.
Yes, they're terrible.
They're terrible. And getting the photos out, that's another thing. Awful. My mother-in-law, towards the end, when she was getting quite elderly, made up albums for her 4 children. She made them up with such pride and put them in those adhesive things. I could have cried when I saw it. You know, then you had to try and very carefully remove the adhesive without taking the image off the photo. Quite difficult. Now, if you're displaying the photos, I would always suggest displaying a copy. And these days, with a digital camera, it's very easy to make a copy, because much, much better if you've got something on display, like the case down the back. There's light, there's probably a bit of dust, there's just general security. Put the copy there. I mean, you can say it's from the original, held by the XYZ Society. Everyone does that. The State Library, I know, of course, they've got a fantastic facility. They don't need to do that, but I think even they occasionally would use copies. And of course, colour photos, we know the colour can fade. They're susceptible. The other thing to be aware of is if someone gives you some movie film. Has anyone got movie film in their collection? Yes. The risk of vinegar syndrome, the deterioration, you can smell it. You do need to get those copied. And the other is, of course, the film which is nitrate film, explosive. So if someone offers you a film collection, you need to be very cautious about what you accept. There we are, Pest Maintenance. So just think about that. There are lots of different systems, but you also need to think about what's safe for yourselves. But cleaning, dusting and cleaning, and making sure there are no hidden traps, and not leaving food stuff if you've got a communal eating area. Having that one of the tasks at the end of the day, if you have your volunteers working there, that someone takes the rubbish out and puts it in the bin outside the building. Yes, disaster preparedness. And on State Records website, we have a disaster preparedness kit. Guideline number 5, counter disaster strategies for records and record keeping systems. Now that has been developed for government agencies, but the practicalities are the same. You need to have something in place for disaster preparedness, whether it is simply a burst pipe and you've got water all over the floor. We've got a big bin and we've got mops and buckets and things like that in there for dealing with those little emergencies that could grow and be major emergencies. The storage standard, as I've mentioned, is on State Records website. You can download that, and that provides excellent advice. Now, it is catering for institutions such as State Records, but there's no reason why the advice that's provided there isn't going to be just as good for you. Now, there's National Archives of Australia has a number of fact sheets dealing with preservation advice. So the National Archives of Australia website, just go in there and under Records Management, in fact, you'll see a lot of advice. The National Film and Sound Archive also has advice on caring for film, particularly, other things as well. And Archives Outside, which is the State Records blog, and that has information there. There's actually a slide share presentation on disaster recovery. Who has looked at Archives Outside, at the blog on the State Records website? Who's looked at the State Records website? Never.
Yeah, I never.
Never?
Oh, never.
Okay, State Records website has a wealth of information, and included is the Archives Outside blog, which has been developed by Fiona Sullivan and Anthea Brown to help groups such as yours, to help you with all manner of advice on practical issues to do with collections. And of course, as I mentioned, this wonderful book, $95, which has so much information in it about looking after archives and looking after collections, because it's called archives, but we're talking paper-based collection and records in other formats as well. Now, that's the end of this particular session. So before we move off storage, are there any questions? Yes.
Just going to mention there's a new scanner on the market called FlipPal scanner that's sold through Goulds. It's battery powered and you sit it on a document and you can scan, and it's often useful for getting those photos.
No, we don't like those.
Reproduced.
We don't like scanners that sit on top of documents, because as a general rule, it sounds lovely, we would say that there's a potential for damage. Better to get a camera, even an ordinary camera, and have it sitting above the document and take the photo that way. And digital cameras, you can pay a fortune for them, or you can pay less than $100, and the difference isn't that great.
You can reverse the scanner and put the document on it, and it's approved by the American Archives Authority.
Yeah, but not things on top of documents. Yes, if you reverse it, that is fine, but no, we say not things on top, because yes, I'm sure you or I will be very careful, but if you've got something very fragile, even just putting something on top. So always better to have no intervention, no touching, have the image taken above, and these days, as I say, you can do it with a digital camera and it works quite well.
So how often do you measure moisture content?
Well, we at State Records would do it on a routine basis, going from storage area to storage area. I would say have it as a routine, I guess monthly certainly, but certainly after extreme rain, extreme weather conditions. I'd have it, I think you can get thermohydrographs that are, I don't know how much they cost, and that's what usually measures the moisture. You could either arrange to have someone come and do a reading regularly, or you could decide that you might actually buy one of those. Depends how vulnerable you think you are, how much money you've got, and do it that way.
So how much money are we talking about, one of those?
I don't know. I don't know the cost
We
of
had
those.
one in ours that's selling a few dollars.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah.
Run by battery.
Yep. Yes, I've got a question.
Yes, vintage photographs in vintage mounts in vintage frames that had charm. You're suggesting that you ditch them?
Depends on the acid. In frames, I would probably leave them. Always the temptation for me would be to remove them from the frame and make a copy, a digital copy, so that you've got a record, so you've got something to back up. Because the trouble is with photos, as with everything, once it's gone, it's gone. If you don't have a backup copy, if you don't have the negative, you've got the negative, then that's a different thing. You can look after the negative. No, the risk with the with frames, with the mat or the mount, is that it's acid, and the acid will damage the photograph, and the same with vintage, with
In a period house where such display is in fact in keeping.
Yes.
And realising storage is in fact really a problem.
Yeah.
But when they are displayed, to actually have the original frames is a temptation.
Well, it is. I think the original frames are fine. I would be very tempted though to put a copy of the photo in the frame. That's what I would suggest. Yes.
We, at the start of the saga of #2, it was basically a whole pile of photos, included lots of negatives. The
Yeah.
photos were from a collection of a press photographer. They're labelled with little envelopes, but they really need to be gone through more. At the moment, just a few boxes. How do we particularly care for the negatives and do anything to identifying with that and to be properly doing something with this photo collection? Because we don't really have the expertise.
Okay, there are.
on here.
Right. Well, I can't give you the quick answer, but the short answer is that in the handout that I've given, there is some advice on storing negatives. I would suggest that you also have a look at the documents that the National Archives of Australia has prepared, and also at the documents that have been prepared by the National Film and Sound Archive, because they have got very specific advice there on negatives, on all of those things. So that's what I'd be suggesting, because your negatives are very important. You do need to preserve those, and you need to think about how you describe them. The metadata, we'll be talking about that later, but the metadata, the information about the images, is all important, because it's just like getting those photos without any ID, so you've got the same problem.
If you've got a situation where there is no available site for you to store things or to show them as well, archival material or items, you can't, nothing from the council. What are the major drawbacks to having this in a caravan at a reasonable cost?
A disaster, I would say. A disaster waiting to happen, quite frankly. I would suggest, if you can't do anything locally, see whether there is another group that you can have a reciprocal arrangement with, even another council, but certainly don't consider anything like a caravan. Some places have used those containers that they use for shipping containers. That would be a better option, as long as you could control the environment, but a caravan, no. Now, as I mentioned, there'll be a little bit of overlap of some of the things we're talking about, but I'm going to talk now about collection policies. We've talked about buildings. So we've got ourselves a reasonable space. We know that we need to be concerned with the environment, controlling the temperature, humidity, making sure that they're stable, making sure people can't get in, making sure that the area is secured and is safe from fire and pests, and that we've got people who have got keys, and we've got a process going there. So now we're going to talk about the collection. Now, for many of you, I know you've got the collection already, but sometimes it's good too to step back from the collection and think, well, what are we trying to do? Now, I have been to a museum in country New South Wales, I'm sure you've all been to them, where they have about 100 portable typewriters. Now, you would have to ask yourself why. If it was the museum of the Olivetti Portable Typewriter Company, maybe there would be a reason to have 100 because they would show the evolution over time. But so often happens with museums, historical societies and family history groups, they can't say no. You know why they can't say no? Because they haven't got a collection policy and because they don't want to be nasty to people. Because they think, well, if I'm nice to Mrs. Bloggs, she's given us all this rubbish, but what I actually want is that one wonderful 1890s wedding dress. Would love to display that. If we're nice to her now, maybe she'll give us the other thing. Sometimes with collections, and this is the same for private archives, we have to say no. We have to be able to explain to people why we don't want to collect something. And the simplest way is by having an agreed collection policy. And you can make that, you can scope that any way that you want. But that's an important thing because you also need to think that if you're going to be accepting material, can you actually store it? Can you house it? Are you going to be forced to consider unsuitable storage simply because you want to say yes? So they're all questions a bit hard to answer, I know. Okay, just a few terms and definitions. Archivists, they love all these words, you know. Accessioning, but it means accepting something coming in to your collection. Take legal and physical custody. It's good to have terms like this because it explains the processes of what you're going to do. It doesn't matter whether you've got 6 metres or 6 boxes of records. It's important that you've got those processes there. The provenance, it's important with records. What makes records important is who created them, why they were created, when they were created. They're the important things, linking the records to the creator. Now, in government, as a friend of mine once said to me, it's a given. Well, it's not really. In government, we have to understand that this little tiny agency that might have existed, the Dairy Products Board. I went to visit when they were closing down. There was one man left there. Everyone else had gone. But the Dairy Products Board hasn't existed for 40 years, probably. But it did exist once and it did create records. A minor point, but it's important when you're talking about collections that you link it to Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were pioneers in the area. Mrs. Brown's father was Mr. Smith, who got the first land grant. Well, things like that, they're important. That's where there is that wonderful link between genealogy, so often, and records. And why sometimes within local historical societies we need to think about the people, the person. That's what gives it a bit more oomph. That's what makes it, if you like, a bit sexier. Now the metadata, they're terms we throw in. It's the data about the context. That's just a word that's used. So developing your collection policy. A succinct body of authoritative information. You need to have an acquisition policy or collection policy that it basically summarises the fundamentals of what you're going to be collecting. So you need to have that endorsed, and you need to have that endorsed by a committee and even by the whole membership at your AGM so that everyone is in agreement. It helps you to avoid those pitfalls and diversions. It also helps you to avoid collecting 100 Olivetti portable typewriters. So we then have it in place and we can go. Yes?
I was going to say, one of the things one needs to be conscious of is the current versus the future in doing those things, because it can be an excuse for jettisoning things whose importance is not yet recognised.
Oh yes, that's true. But it's a question of quantity too, and of what we're actually trying to do. Years ago I went to a conference where the man from, it was an archival conference, where the man from the Automobile Museum of South Australia, something like that, gave a talk. And I was a bit sceptical. I thought, what on earth would that have to do with archives? It was a fantastic talk, and one of the points that he made was that if they were offered a car but only 1 or 2 had been imported into Australia, they would say no, because that didn't represent anything. That was an aberration. That it might be, if it was a Mercedes, okay, that's for the Mercedes Museum, not for a museum which is documenting cars, automotives from 1900 to wherever. So it's things like that too. It's thinking about relevance. Anyway, So this is factors influencing acquisition, the who, the what and the why.
Talking about provenance and all of that, and photos,
Yes.
what do you do with all of the ones that have been beautifully documented as view, an unknown group and stuff like that? Do they go in the round file, or do they?
No, I would say not until you've tried all avenues. And one of the things with photographic collections is that there's an awful lot of people who know a lot about photos. I would suggest with any photographic collection where you're not sure of the history of them or what they're of and those sorts of things, is get a story in the local newspaper about them and get people interested, because there's an awful lot of people around who do know and who can help. Sometimes, unfortunately, it does mean the round bin, but that's the very, very end. That's absolutely the very end. And that's a very difficult decision to make. Yes, so you've got to, I'll come to you. Yep, you've got one.
There was an article in this month's History magazine about
Yes, that's right.
quite technical, and you need a bit of equipment.
That's that very
Yeah,
clever
close
way
eye.
of dating them, using wonderful logarithms and things I don't even understand. But yes, that's. But that you see, that creates immediately. You can say, well, here's a photo of a building in wherever, in Burrell, and then someone says, oh yeah, but actually I can tell that was 1890s. 1890s. Then it's comparing, it's a little bit like detective work. It's piecing it together. Okay, we know then this is probably, now I know here we've got Beverly from Cogra, a photo of Cogra. Now using this magical logarithm, we know it's the 1890s. Okay then. Let's go and compare some other photos that we know definitely are from the same time period, the same place. Because there we might be able to see, oh, the angle's slightly different, and that might help to identify. Something like getting a date can be a big help, and yes, there is that excellent article. Yep.
I was just going to comment that some things like furniture and background can be important.
My word, yes.
So if you can digitise before you put it in the round
Oh,
bin,
yes,
with
definitely.
documentation about what
Yeah.
you do know is much better than just...
No, the round bin is only for the very end, and you're quite right that furniture, very important. And floor coverings, linoleum, how do you can't pronounce it now? You can't buy it, I don't think, now. But if you see houses, you can see it, very distinctive patterns. Yes?
Also, with views, because you were talking about things with views, they actually do demonstrate how a landscape has changed over time. So
They
there's
do.
a value even on that.
Yes, that's right. If you know where it is meant to be, that's right, because often comparing then with now. Yes, I would only say throw out as absolutely when you've tried every single thing, and certainly with any photos, do look at digitisation, but of course don't just digitise them and put them all on a giant floppy disk, because you won't be able to find them again. Look at the function of what you're trying to do. Think about, there's this wonderful thing, what we will not forget and therefore not remember. So think about what you want to keep and consider.
Where does
Yes.
ephemera come into all this? Is there a...
There is a place for it, and it's very, very worthy. It is important, and they often are items that are stored separately because they're part of, I guess, the history, and a lot of places actually store them as an ephemera collection.
But do you have it sitting below the collection, or?
No, it's part of. It's part of. And if you can do it, is to, with databases, etc., try and link the item in the ephemera collection, let's say a mayoral ball, to a photograph. Link it intellectually to a photograph of the mayoral ball, to your information folder about the famous mayoral ball of 1890 when they all got drank and sang songs or something. And that's the beauty of computers and of having different databases that you can link. You don't need to physically store things together. You can create links through databases, through indexes. But storing ephemera separately is good, because it also means ephemera is one of those things which lends itself perfectly to display purposes. So if you digitise it, and some of those invitations, let's say from the turn of the 19th century, are very beautiful. So should we accept all that's offered? I think you need to consider, if you're going to accept digital records, can you store them? Do you want publications? If publications are already available in a library, and the State Library, should have all publications from New South Wales. Do you want to collect extremely fragile? Is it going to be more trouble than it's worth? Or pest infested, particularly mould, because the mould could spread to the rest of the collection? Are there going to be donor limits on accepting the records? So you need to think about those things. That's a sample acquisition collection policy. I didn't include that in the handout, but if anyone's interested in that later, I'm more than happy to provide a copy of that. It's available in Keeping Archives. Yes?
I saw at the bottom there you've got loan. We're in a particularly difficult position in that we have a very, very long-term loan, which we'd like to know, and nobody seems to be able to put it on. If there's a statute of limitations where it becomes ours through lack of...
No, I would get legal advice on things like that.
That's vague too.
Yeah.
That's vague too.
Yeah, I know. It is. And that's unfortunately, when we're talking about all of these things, we've often got a legacy of material like that. At my own historical society, one of the members got very excited because a man in the local area had gone around and photographed all the houses, which were Art Deco. Beautiful photos. And I said, but can we use them again? Have you got copyright clearance? Oh, I didn't think to ask. Have we got a donor form? No, I didn't think to ask. So it's that kind of thing the whole time. It's sometimes with something like that, it would be advised to get legal.
No one will give us a definitive answer.
No, well, I think you have to, beyond a certain point, you have to assume that it is yours, but you have to be aware that the family, particularly if it's something that's got some sort of value, the family might pop along and say, hey, that was Grandpa's, I want that back.
There's no proof that they have less title, more title than we do.
That's right. It's a tricky one, very tricky.
The gentleman who left this whole of items was the founding member of the society.
Yeah.
And I think in the time there were no such things as forms and the like.
I think that's unfortunately, I mean, that's all you can do is document the efforts that you've taken and hope that you don't get someone coming along. Yes, got a question?
We got bitten by that.
Yeah.
By lack of record in the past of things that were on loan, because a family member of the person who lent this agricultural equipment came and said, oh, Mum's dead, I want everything back.
That's
but
right.
because they didn't know exactly what that family had given, they took like a whole truckload of stuff.
I know.
And so it's felt subsequently that more was taken than was entitled to.
Yes.
And you've got no comeback really if you've got no paperwork.
That's right, and if no, that's the trouble. And so a lot of it is not to say that those who went before us have done the wrong thing, but oftentimes societies were started by enthusiastic amateurs, and oftentimes it seemed excessively bureaucratic. I know when I say things to my own group about doing things, I see them looking, thinking, yes, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? She works in public service. But sometimes it does pay because these things can come back, and it is important to have these processes because then you're quite clear on how you can use things. Ownership. You need to be very sure about who owns it, and that doesn't matter whether it's a local historical society or the Mitchell Library. You need to be sure of the legal ownership. You need to be sure of Indigenous rights too, in terms of the intellectual content within material, because you may have private papers which contain information gathered about Indigenous people in the area, in the local area. Maybe you don't close it, you just be aware of it, that there could be sensitivities potentially, or maybe you just, you think about it and just consider. Collections can be acquired by gift. You can also go out and ask. It never hurts to be active in the community. You know that a local business is closing down, and a business that's been in the area for years and years and years. Chemist shops in particular, they have lots of interesting records, but lots of other places. It never hurts to make a gentle approach, politely, to see what's going to happen to the records. Yes?
How do you treat it when someone's passed away and their kids dump all their stuff on the footpath? The next door neighbour who's in the historical society notices there's something that's useful and says, well, we have that, and it's just coming like
You're not
that.
supposed to do it. You're not supposed to go through people's rubbish.
No, they're not going through it.
No, I know,
They've
but
seen
you're
it
not
and
supposed
they've
to do it.
asked
Well, then you
and
have to
they've
write.
given it.
Then you would have to write to the family and say that it was located.
But no, but the family the family member has said, yes, you can have it.
Oh, that's all right, but yeah, yes, but
That's
you
not
need.
exactly all documented
No,
nicely.
but you do need to be very careful about rummaging through things on the footpath that look interesting.
But
and,
someone said, not rummaging through that other
Oh, I
scenario.
know,
happened
but
to us,
you know,
not
yeah,
one.
I know. Yes, you need always to document how it came into your custody. Yes.
Do you know of any organisation that offers any precedents or forms that societies might use? For
Yes,
this
there's a
purpose?
lot of forms in the back of this, and I'll be coming to those in a minute to show you. So you need a donor form. Now this is just the process of documenting the acquisition. I'm not going to go through that.
So just on the last point, we find it quite handy to have very good relationships with local funeral directors.
Yes. Yes, I'd say that's good advice. Yes, definitely, definitely. Now that's an acknowledgement form. That's just one that my own society uses. Then you must have a record of when you've received it, an accession register. There's a guide there in your handout. And there's a couple of different ways of doing it, but it's important that when it comes in, when the item, whether it's a collection of papers or an object, that you actually document it in your accession register. And it's good there, with terms of staffing and personnel, to have that as someone's responsibility. So I know that most societies are run by volunteers, and of course, as a volunteer, we all like to have something that's our thing to do. So you make that someone's responsibility, accessioning, because it is important. And it's all the reasons we just talked about.
Are these on the website, are they?
No, these are in the back of this.
Oh, okay.
They're in the back of that. And some of them, any of these forms that I'm showing, I can make those available. They're not on our website though. You need to think about 2 different formats. Again, coming back to whether you want to accept different formats. So basically, when you're going to be accessioning, you need to have all that information about who, the why and the when, and you need to write to the depositor and let them know. Confirm with them what you've received, the fact that you can have it, and confirm the copyright status, and confirm whether you can make copies, and also whether you can make copies and charge for the copies. If they've sent you some lovely photos that you think would be very, very interesting and they're all nicely described, are you able to copy them, and are you able to charge people when you do provide copies when they come in? Sometimes you do need to throw things out, and even there you do need to document what you've done. Document that you have de-accessioned and you've let the donor know. What we need to do is think about how are we going to describe it, what do we need to do. You might have a lot of objects without organisational context. You might have photos. We've talked about the photos and how they don't have anything on them that identifies them. So what do we do? So we might have a pile of files that have come to us like that. Any way of finding information. Sometimes you might get something like that, a mess, just a mess. Arrangement. We need to think about arrangement. We need to think about describing. Arranging and describing. So we need to think about who is the creator of the record. If you're talking about archival records, we're talking about the record series. Now I think for most of you, you won't be thinking about record series, you'll be just thinking about who created them and treating the records as a collection. But if there's a lot of material, you might decide to break it up so that you've got the letters coming in, letters received, that's one series. You might have the minute books. It might have been a local charity or a local organisation that's now closed up. It might have minute books. That would be a separate series. You might have a local sports club. That would be a sort of something that most people would have, a local sports club. So you might have correspondence, incoming letters, copies of the letters sent, and the minute books, plus a whole lot of photos. It is useful to treat them as series, as we would in the archival world, to say each of those are a separate category. Rather than trying to mix them up, they are an entire collection made up of different classes or groups of categories of records. Now, if we're thinking about records and we're thinking about, in terms of the way that an archivist would think about the records, then we think about the provenance. That's always it comes back to, because that informs your collection policy. You have a collection policy that says, I will collect all of the records, or I will collect records from private donors from the Randwick area. That's the kind of thing that we will collect. We won't collect records from DY. If someone approaches us from DY and they have no local link, we will suggest that they approach another group. So it's important. If we think about, this is a great petition here, 4,500 signatures of gold miners. Now, if you think about that petition, it's in the Department of Lands, it's actually held by State Records. But you have to understand why. Why did they petition? What was the point of doing it? It's the same with any record. Why did they create a particular record? And that's part of that whole provenance and understanding the history and the administrative history of the records. Now, the other thing that we talk about with archival documents is that we keep the original order. Very tempting when something comes to you. You think, oh, I could scrapbook this. No one would do that, but some people do. I'll gather it all together and I'll scrapbook it. No, if you're getting the collection of documents from the local sports club that's now wound up, think about keeping those records exactly as the sporting club might have kept them. They would have kept correspondence together, they would have kept minute books together, they would have kept other records together. Yes, you might sort the correspondence into date order because that would have been how it was created, but what it does is keep the context in which the records have been created. So original order, it reflects the way that the records and the action was performed. It helps us to understand how the records are used, and it also allows us to be able to better use the records. Nothing more frustrating than going through a pile of documents that are all out of order. Much easier if we can go through and use the order. But we don't impose an order that we think we'd like it to be in. So a file, the way a file is created, the oldest things on the bottom. Simple things like that. We add to it, don't we? So we've talked about accessions, a newly arrived group of records. It's an accession. We've talked about how important it is to record that accession as it comes in. We use the pro formas, and any of the forms I will make them available either on the RAHS website with discussion with Maria, or we'll come up with another way. So that they're just examples. I warn you, they're not meant to be definitive. You might be able to come up with an even better example, but they are a way of doing some of these important processes like an accession. It also allows you to identify things. Condition of the records, so if they've got silverfish, mould, or there's something else that's a bit funny about them, it allows you to document that. It also allows you to document there and then the details of the donor, contact details, all of that kind of thing. And to think about the relationship of those records to records that you might already have in your collection. So they might be the records of the XYZ sports club, but that sports club might have been a predecessor of another sports club in the area, or it might have had a relationship with a sports club from an area nearby. It's creating those sorts of things, that kind of information, which can then be used in your finding aid, because after all, what a lot of the things that you're doing is to make records accessible so that someone will come to your beautiful historic house and look at those photos on the walls, copies I hope, look at the records, come and use the records, because that's what I'm on about, and that's what for most of us, we want people to come and use our records. We want to know that our efforts are being appreciated. Now, also when records are coming in, we don't accept records that don't have a list. But I can bet my bottom dollar that if in a local area, you're not going to be able to insist on that. I mean, it'd be great if you do, but just be aware that sometimes things come in and they do look a bit disordered, as we saw some of those examples. There was a film I went to see recently called, it's got Daniel Radcliffe. It's a ghost story. It's not a particularly great film, I have to say. But he goes to the house, he has to sort through the papers. It's an archivist's delight or nightmare. There are desks everywhere with papers falling all over the place. I don't know what he doesn't actually do anything in the end. But, well, I wouldn't either, it was horrible. But I think the ghost came and scared him. But anyway, it was all papers everywhere. That's sometimes what happens. We have papers on our desk, something happens, all gets swept into a box, equivalent thereof. So we've talked about accessioning a register, whether it's a book or a paper-based document. So you need to record a sheet for each accession. These are the sorts of things that we would, ingredients of what you would have in your accessioning record. It's good to also record who actually took custody, who is the compiler, because it might be Mrs. Brown or Mr. Brown who's no longer involved with the society because they're a bit frail, but they're fine mentally and they might know all about why you took in the XYZ record. You think, why would we have done that? And they'll say, we took that because Miss Smith, who was the donor, was the granddaughter of the person who had the first pub in the area or something else. A little piece of information which somehow didn't make its way there at the time. Maybe there was nowhere to record it, but it gives you that context. So also physical condition, we've talked about these things, and we need to be very careful when you're handling your records. Basic things, wash your hands. Not that I'm not a germ freak, but think about hands, they carry oil apart from anything else. And if you put hand cream on it, even more oil. So sometimes with handling documents, gloves, state records, we use rubber gloves. So you can get those. Cotton gloves, they say less because they cover dust and they make your hands.
Some people allergic to latex.
They are. And you can sometimes put cotton underneath and put the rubber glove over the top. That gets around that problem to an extent. Try to avoid touching and also always supporting things when you're holding. Don't just hold things up like that. Gently always with documents. Remove clips, pins and staples because they can make rust and do further damage. We end up with things that look like that, which is a metal. Take them along to the local metal place, you might get something for it. And of course you've got your source information. If we look at recording the types of material, so we're coming back to looking at who created it, talking about these groups of records, these series of records, minute books, correspondence, photographs. You might there get a collection of ephemera, some invitations that were sent to the president of the local sports club, and you will keep those. Keep those as the ephemera collection of the XYZ Sports Club, which is part of one of your archival collections. So keep notes, document everything. Sometimes you do have these problems. We've got two sources, no apparent relationship. You've got to keep just noting everything down, and of course asking people. That's the great thing in a local community, is ask people about records. So we've talked about establishing original order. So if we remove records, if we try and create our own structure by breaking up the collection from the XYZ Sporting Club and putting all those nice papers there in one folder to do with a particular person who was a local identity, another bit over there, we've broken up, we've lost what was a valuable and important resource, that collection, rather than thinking that we want these nice subject folders. One of the groups of records that seem to slip through the floorboards, literally if not metaphorically, are the records from local schools, admission books and punishment registers and other types of records. Because so often what happened was you'd have a principal who was there for many, many years, and they would take very good care of the records and take them home and put them under the bed often. And they're usually it was the woman, but not necessarily, would discover this cache of records when the person went up to the big schoolyard in the sky and say, what will we do with these? And so often they get tossed out. Sometimes they anonymously appear at state records. They're sent to us or they appear at the reference desk. I know many historical societies have holdings such as those, admission books, other sorts of government records. We would love to hear about them. We're not about coming and grabbing them. We're not the archives police. But if you do have collections like that, I mentioned the infectious diseases registers that are held by lots of local historical societies. We don't want to come and take them away, but we'd love to know that if you've got them and we would love to be able to provide you with a copy, or if you want to keep them, that's fine, and we can get a copy. But it's not about coming and taking, but it's identifying where collections of records that have strayed, we call them estrays, that have strayed from official custody, to know that they're being properly cared for. Okay, we're talking about the description of records, and when you get your records, you do need to be able to describe them, because they don't jump up at you and talk to you. You need to be able to, in terms of what you write, document the information about the records. You also need to be able to consider what the researcher is going to get out of the records and how they're going to be able to use them. And we talk there about context. I hate using that word, but it's about describing for someone else using them. You know exactly why you have the records, and you know that it was because Mrs. Bloggs was sick to death of that box of records from her husband sitting there under the table. She didn't want to see them ever again, and you gave them to the local historical society. But we want to then talk about what those records are. They're the records about a local identity who might have had some sporting prowess, who might have been involved with the local RSL, who might have been involved with other various community groups. It's all those things. So they're the sorts of things that we need to put when we describe those records, when we put them into a finding aid. So we need to think, well, who created the records, who wrote it? Who owned the dress, the beautiful wedding dress? Why was it made? When was it made? Is the information accurate? Sometimes you're given information. It's like family histories, really, isn't it? You're told, yes, your family is related to the English royalty. And you go and do the family history, and the closest that you ever come is they came out on a ship that was called the Royal Consort. Or some such thing. Yeah, so you do need always, when you get given the information about the beautiful object, is it accurate? You know, people have myths perpetrated. This was used by the first child born in the area, the cradle or some other thing. And you've got to check it. It's like, as I always, because I do lots of talks about family history, checking at least 2 sources. You know, just because someone tells you something, you better just check, make sure, absolutely. Think about how you can verify it and how you can find out more about it. So if we're talking about the way that an archivist would describe things, the same principles apply, whether we're talking about government records or we're talking about a local collection. So you're talking about here the creating person, you're talking about the series, and I have introduced you very gently to the notion of series. That is, like records, created with a single purpose. The format can change over time. Minute books can go from being handwritten to being typed. These days they're on CD. We talk about the items making up a series. So 16 minute books making up a sequence of minute books. So if we get a photo, we might be saying, well, who donated that photograph? Who took it? Because that can be different. Copyright. That's that big bugbear with photos. Anything taken before 1955 is fine. If you read the Copyright Act, you're fine with copyright before 1955. Taken before 1955. Taken afterwards, you're going to have to read the Copyright Act and also make sure that if you're getting a donation that you've got copyright clearance. So, did they donate other photos? What's the starting and end date for the collection? So when was this photo taken? Who was in the photo? Now, with that wonderful algorithm, they're probably going to be able to tell you when the photo was taken, but it's the who, and that's yes.
There's another problem with photos, and that's photos of school children. Because there's the date thing with that, where you can't display them without permission.
Well, if they're before 55, you're pretty right, but yes, you're quite right. Recent ones, yes, you've got to be very careful. These days, yes.
Famous photographers, does that include 1955?
Yes, it does. 55.
Even if it's their
yes,
professional work? Like
55 is fine. You're fine with up to 55. After that, you know, so I would always say use photos that were taken before 1955, no matter what you... No, I'm only joking. Sometimes I feel like saying that though. Yes, when we try to use material from our collection, photographs in our collection, when we want to put them on the website, that's what one of the things that we look at. People looking at photos is not a problem. People taking even a reference copy, a low resolution or photocopy or something like that, is not going to be quite the issue. It's people wanting to publish. It's the republication that's really the concern. With a photo like this, and we had someone else make a very sensible suggestion, when you're dating something, look at what else is in the picture. Now, I don't know anything about automobiles, but even I can tell this is not a modern one. Unless, of course, they've been dressed up to do a reenactment. Probably not, but that's one of those traps. And the other great trap is with women, in particular with women, and it's not a sexist comment, is that women often kept the fashion of clothing, particularly in the 19th century when people didn't have as much, disposable income, I suppose. They often kept the styling of hair from a particular point in their life, and they often wore clothing for much, much longer than we do today. So that you look at it and you think, well, okay, that looks as though it's a dress from the 1890s. You've got to always think, well, is it? Or is it just that the lady's wearing the same, she's kept the same dress, her best dress? So if we're talking about the description, looking at these other sorts of sources. Internet research, that's one of my favourite ones. We were friends having a dinner party and we were talking about internet research and the comment that everyone says, I did my research on Google. Now, the internet is fantastic, the Wikipedia is fantastic, using Google is fantastic, it's settled many an argument at home about dates and things like that, but just be aware that, like everything, it is created by people. You've always got to go and check other things. Always check, recheck and check again. Look, they're all great tools, and the internet is a great gateway for being able to look at newspapers. You can look at published directories because after all they are now available through a number of those third-party providers. I know that most of you are from historical societies and you might say, oh, Ancestry, that's family history, I don't want to go there. But Ancestry and Find My Past are publishing things like police gazettes, they're publishing things like Sands Directory. They are tools which are equally as valuable for the local historian as for the family historian. Records are not created with family historians in mind. Records are created by public servants, they're created by the local club, or they're created by somebody else. They have multiple purposes these days. Interviews are always useful too, oral histories. Beware of an oral history. They're great. I belong to the society. I've given talks for them. But just be aware. I give my story. Now, I'm about to retire. Probably most people will know that. I've worked in archives for a long time. I'm not telling you how long, but a long time. If someone were to sit down and ask me to talk about my memories, I would think I'd be fairly accurate. But so many of the things that we remember, it's very selective. And we put a different interpretation on it now, quite differently from what might have been the case then. So it's like sitting down with grandma and asking her to talk about the family history or talking to someone, a local area. It's a great source, but again, you need to double check. Series description. These are the kinds of things to think about, that the same creator, you create a numbering system. You don't have to, you can use whatever system that you want. But think about how people coming into your institution, your organisation, how they might use the records. So think about a finding aid. It might be a very, very simple thing, a sheet of paper. It might be something on a computer. But have something that you can help people to use your collection. But having a collection beautifully described, accessioned, lots of digital copies, if nobody comes and uses it, why? Because I think for most of us, unless you are working in a very specific area for a type of record, maybe a medical library or something else, where there might be reasons why the general community doesn't use the records, someone will use them, even if it's under very particular conditions. Even the special collections in the State Library, if you've got the magical gold card and you go there on the right day, you can probably access them. So a finding aid, so it just gives you some information. And it's like the how-to. It allows you to get into the records, and it will allow the records to be used. Now, you see there, we've got a photo, someone with white gloves and someone with latex gloves. In the break, someone mentioned to me that a lot of people, and Peter Orlovich, who taught me when I was doing the archives course, he doesn't say to people that you have to wear gloves. It's true, you don't have to. It's just keeping the amount of times that you touch the paper to a minimum. And sometimes with very fragile documents, it in fact is better to have very clean hands and just very carefully touch, because even with latex gloves, you've lost quite that same sensation. And to finish with, again, thinking about the publication, keeping archives, that covers so much of what we've talked about today. So I do stress again, it's worth buying. You can buy it from the Australian Society of Archivists website. If you go to the shop, and you'll get a page like that, and then you can shop online.